Welcome back to the Be Ruthless Show. I'm your host, Sam Ruth, and joining me today is Sarah Jane Smith, an embodiment teacher, grief ritual facilitator, and coach who helps fellow childless, not by choice women integrate grief, amplify agency, and embody possibility. Using the foundations of embodiment, self compassion, grief tending, and finding belonging, she helps women uncover the confidence, spark, and clarity that was buried on the way to becoming childless. She has over 1,000 hours of formal yoga teacher plus meditation training and over 4,500 hours of experience leading classes, facilitating workshops, retreats, and coaching cohorts in person and online. She's a health and life coach through the Health Coach Institute and has trained in grief teaching, grief tending, and grief ritual facilitation with Frances Weller. Blah, blah, blah. She offers one-on-one group coaching and courses online and in person at embodiedpossibility.com. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is an under-discussed and very important topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for recognizing that.
I'm one.
Well,
and mine is not fertility. My husband and I reconnected late in life and wanted our time together. And he, passed away unexpectedly before we had the time to discuss, so it's something that people, I think, don't think about. I think it's just happy families, and those of us without children, there's not so many, and we cherish each other.
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of us. We're hidden in plain sight. There's lots of assumptions that those of us who don't have children, we wanted it that way, and that things are just great and happy and woohoo, life turned out as we planned, So there's not a lot of thought given to, why doesn't that person have children? And maybe they wanted them. And what does life look like when you wanted children and you don't have them, not able to for whatever reason, through whether it's a story similar to mine, infertility, or a story similar to yours, circumstance and life events.
And just like any type of grief, people don't ask. It's something that we could discuss. It doesn't pain me to discuss.
Yeah, we're a grief-phobic culture, right? Sort of if somebody, as you know from your experience, having a partner pass away, people expected you to be feeling whatever you're feeling, sad for a determined amount of time, and then, well, you're supposed to be over it, get on with it, move on with your life. And then people don't know what to say. And so they don't say anything. And it's like there's this idea that people don't want to remind us of these things in our life. And it's like, well, you don't have to remind me. This is something that I'm constantly thinking about and living, as I'm sure with your situation and your spouse that passed away. I mean, you're not forgetting them. No one's needing to remind you of them. So it's this odd place where we end up just feeling isolated and alone, and like people don't really care to ask,
Well, and there are things you just don't get included in.
Absolutely.
Because it's with kids, and if you know me my entire life, I mean, from the moment I was old enough, I was babysitting to coaching to camp counselor to working with kids in any way I could. So, my nieces, everything, I find it in other ways, and my story isn't finished. Whether I think about maybe one day I'll adopt or do something that, it's still an option, but other people don't ask.
Yeah, for sure. And if it's something that you really wanted your whole life, and as you just described, you've found ways to work with and be with children, but that's different than having your own children and having an idea or a way of being or a life that you expected, being able to live out that life, right? because along with our wants and our hopes, we build in identity. So this identity of future mother, and when we come to a place where, for myself, I'm permanently childless. I'm not going to pursue adoption or foster or any of those options that are available to some people. They're not available to all people. So how do I view myself and my life and my path forward with this permanently childless identity? That's what I'm really interested in helping women discover and see the possibilities that are there, because there are many, many, many ways to live a life.
I mean, my mind goes immediately to travel, right?
Sure.
Like, you can embrace independence.
Yeah, some people can travel. And, there's lots of things that are available to some people and aren't available to others, so it's a real exercise in imagination and daydreaming and playing with what could come to be, what steps could I make to make this something that I thought might never be possible for myself actually happen. And one thing that happens along the way with folks that I've worked with who've wanted to have a child and not been able to, there's sort of this fear of trying for something, thing that you wanted, and you really tried in all kinds of ways to have come to fruition. It didn't happen. So there's this fear and this lived experience of, well, what I want doesn't happen. And the last place I put a lot of time, effort, love, and focus into having something come to pass, it didn't work out. So a lot of us really benefit from speaking with other childless women to kind of stoke up those fires of possibility and seeing what other people are doing.
Infertility by itself is not openly discussed. Again, it's not dinner conversation, but even miscarriage. I am thinking of my clients, 26 years in this field, and I can think of, probably on one hand, the people who said, this happened to me and I talked about it when it happened to me. I can think of hundreds who say, I'm dealing with this now 20 years later. It's not talked about. There isn't a funeral. Grief by itself is uncomfortable, but it's a more silent and hidden grief.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's what they call disenfranchised grief. So a grief that's not recognized. I myself have experienced multiple pregnancy losses, and my healthcare providers, great. They were great in some aspects, but the main messaging was, oh, it's really common, don't worry about it. And so it's like, well, just because something's common doesn't mean that you don't need or want validation, acknowledgement, resources to how to be with the feelings of what happened, right? I mean, death is the most common thing around. But you would never say that to somebody who lost somebody dear to them.
It blows my mind. I'm doing this book collaboration. It's called Faces of Grief, and it's people sharing their stories. We had a call last night, and we were talking about where we want this book. Where are we going to get this book outside of individual people's hands? And some of the people were saying, hospitals. And I know better. I've been banging my head against the wall trying because of that. Because for whatever reason, They see it so much.
Mhm.
They don't provide the resources.
Mhm.
Anyone watching, listening, if you're willing, please reach out. We need them. We want
Mhm.
them. We need them. It's not provided at the
Mhm.
moment that we
Mhm.
need it most.
Or even just the idea that this, in terms of pregnancy loss, this is something that it's okay to grieve. It's like we almost need permission and some ideas around, well, what does that look like? What does grieving look like? It's okay to have some kind of ceremony or thing that you do to mark that this is an event that happened, a being that passed, but it's all kind of hush hush and sort of like there's this idea that, well, it never really happened. It didn't actually have the baby, so therefore it doesn't count as a loss. But it really, really does, because from the moment that you conceive, you are living the identity of a mother, probably even before that when you're trying. So you have taken on the identity of it, you're operating from a certain place, and it is a valid loss that deserves and needs to be recognized. Otherwise, as you say, 20 years later, it's coming up and like, oh, this is something that I shoved aside and that had this, and then this domino effect.
This, if we could draw a picture, this is the problem with the perception of how we handle grief.
Mm-hmm.
This is 100% unhealthy. And
Mm-hmm.
in my ideal world, there is a budget. Funds are going places. Bring in a me,
Mm-hmm.
doctors, nurses. You don't have to do it. Bring in the staff to be there to handle and bring in a photographer, create a ritual, do something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be the people who have a different skill set, but we have to acknowledge it. And we have to, I mean, I wasn't even given a pamphlet. Again, it drives me nuts. But these people last night who have not been banging their heads against the wall, were just, go to hospitals, go to funeral homes. I've been doing this, and I'm not asking why. I'm done trying to figure out why. It's just not done there. So if anyone does it differently and is interested, please, we need to change and help people literally the moment it happens, because number one, they're in shock and they might not know they need it yet.
Mm-hmm.
We do. We need to take action for them. I
Mm-hmm.
people coming to me months, years later saying, I wish I knew. I wish I did something then. We can help people before it turns into something else.
I really like what you're saying about it doesn't have to be specialist. Like grieving is a human capacity. It's that we've just forgotten it. So it's not even about learning to do new things. It's really about remembering, to how to be with feelings. And we had this whole sort of binary of good and bad feelings, negative and positive. And so much societal messaging is all about positive and good feelings, and anything that's like a bit hard or challenging is like, oh, that's bad, and you can't dwell there for too long. Got to look on the bright side or find the silver lining or whatever those tropes are. But being human is about having the capacity to have a full range of emotions. And if we're unable to be with and experience the hard emotions, it actually takes away and limits our capacity to feel the quote unquote good emotions. So we end up in what's known as like this flatline culture, which is just devastating on many, many levels. So it's really in everybody's best interest to remember how to grieve. And for those of us who have had a bit more experience or maybe more interest, and you and the folks that are making the book with, these are the people that we need to hear from.
And I tell this story pretty often. It is uncomfortable.
Sure.
And people do try to move away from it. But even as a child, whatever the first funeral I had to go to was, it was not somebody, it was a family friend. It was somebody who I was not close to. So I was not emotional personally, but I knew it was a sad event. And we stood up and people started talking about, where do you want to go eat? And I was upset by this. And I turned to my dad. I was bothered. And I said to my dad, what is happening? How can you go from this to talking about food and right back to life? So there is a percentage of this world that feels discomfort with avoiding the feelings. I knew that at a young age, and it is okay if you are one of those people to express that, to just say, I'm sad. It doesn't have to be hours of deep talk. It can just simply be, this was hard.
This is uncomfortable. I feel awkward. I feel like in my body, anything. We're so worried also about saying the wrong thing, because we also live in an incredibly judgmental culture, of oh, well, you shouldn't be saying that. And well, what relationship did you have to that person? Or it's almost we have to qualify, or that there's this sense of comparison, that someone's grief or someone's is worth more than somebody else's. And we see this a lot in the childless community. So say somebody who has experienced a stillbirth. Oh, well, they're more allowed to grieve than somebody who was never able to conceive, which is not true at all. It's a completely different experience with a completely different set of things that you might focus on in your grief. But they're both, and everything in between is grief worthy.
I say pain is pain. And anyone who has experienced it understands we all have that in common. And then there is also a benefit to having those who shared the same type of pain.
Sure, absolutely. Finding belonging with those who have had similar experiences is incredibly validating, because oftentimes we keep all of these feelings to ourselves, and we think, oh, well, I'm the only one that feels this way, or why aren't I over this, or I'm making a big deal out of it, gaslighting ourselves. But then when we speak with other people who've had similar experiences, and you hear somebody say something that you think only you have experienced or only you are going through, it's incredibly validating and allows us to relax and feel like, oh, I'm not so outside of things. These are people that I can relate to. And this allows a whole, a softening on a deep psychological and body level, which is necessary to be able to integrate our experiences, and then even open up to the idea that, well, things don't look how I thought they would, and there's still a world of opportunity available.
People saying the wrong things in the first year, maybe longer, year and a half or so, I seriously worried that I would snap at some innocent person for complaining about traffic or something, normal life stuff that I no longer cared about because somebody else said something that might have upset me. As I've moved through grief and developed more tools, I have learned how to respond. People might say things that overstep.
They 1000% will.
Currently, what I get is, when are you going to take your wedding ring off? Or when are you going to start dating? I'm over 6 years without Jim, and I get it from strangers or people in my circle. And I say, never, thank you very much. It's my magical love story, and I have friends who feel that. 4 years ago, I might have lit into them.
Sure.
But I'm able to say, like, please respect it, and I would appreciate it if you don't say it again, because to me, I'm still married, and it's honoring our fairy tale and, my love story. And the people who have said it haven't said it twice. New people have.
Sure.
But the people who have said it heard me. So there is the choice. The cashier, I'm never going to see again. I don't have to tell her. But the people in my circle, I choose to respond to, so that they know that it kind of bothers me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you're touching on a really great point there. First of all, we don't owe anybody an explanation. Just because someone asks you a question, you're not obligated to answer it in any scenario. However, there are different levels of how you're going to answer, how you're going to choose to answer. Like in your example, the cashier at the grocery store, like, no, you don't owe them anything. You could just like, whatever, you probably, you might see them again, but it doesn't really matter. It's not somebody who you're looking to keep a friendship or deepen a friendship with. But then somebody, as you say, a friend who says something insensitive, in my case, it doesn't really happen anymore because I've had the conversations. But frequent one that I get when I meet new people is like, oh, do you have kids? And the answer can be something just straight up like, no, and that's it. And they often will get a follow-up question to that, like, oh, or a statement, because they assume that I've chosen not to, or like something like, oh, lucky you, or you can have mine, or like something totally ridiculous. And depending on the relationship with somebody, if it's somebody who I'm not going to see again, or I'm not really interested in having a deeper relationship with at this point, I just don't respond. I just sort of, and then they usually say something else entirely, change the topic. But if it's somebody who I who doesn't really know my story, who I'm interested in continuing a friendship with, as you suggested in your case, saying something that I feel comfortable saying, that's not going to trigger me or I'm going to feel really emotional about, something like, no, wanted to have children, but it never worked out. And then if they ask a follow-up question that I find intrusive, that I don't want to go into details, I'll say something like, thanks for asking. I'd rather not talk about it. And then I give what I like to call like an off-ramp question, like, I'd rather talk about books. What book are you reading? So then that kind of fills in the gap where they aren't like, oh, sorry, or like there's like space to like keep going down that road. And I'm clear, and then we can talk about something else. But that takes time, as you say. There's lots of times when people asked what I feel like are intrusive questions, and I just was like, oh, I don't know what to say. I'm feeling really upset and emotional. I can't believe you asked that of me. Like, how dare you? I'm thinking all of this in my head. So I actually, at one point, took the time to write down some answers. So thinking of a bunch of different scenarios, from like the cashier at the grocery store, somebody you meet at a dinner party, someone you meet at a professional networking event. You probably answer in 3 different ways. So I took the time to actually write out what those would be, like a little mini script, and practice saying them out loud, so that because I'm always kind of caught off guard by that question somehow, that it's kind of right there to say. And it's like it's a protection for me, because I'm answering from a place that I feel comfortable, and I feel like puts the power back in my hands. So that's something I like to share with my clients, is to do that exercise.
That's amazing. Do you ever freeze? I can picture some of my clients saying, I had it memorized, and I froze.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Everything has happened, from blurting something out to leaving the room and going to the bathroom to cry, to like saying something really pointed and harsh, to then remembering it and saying it. And we just have to give ourselves grace that it's not going to be perfect. And that's not the aim, especially if it's somebody who you're hoping to have, or you already have a good relationship with, because these kinds of things are what deepen friendships and deepen relationships, when people can actually hear you and meet you where you're at, right? Where they can say like, oh, okay, like with your story, so she doesn't want me to ask about that anymore, but they also got to know you a little bit more in there, know your love story and know your reasoning why, which deepens the friendship if they can hear you.
Right. And the two situations are different. In my situation, it's easy to for people to say, I don't want to say the wrong thing. That I can tell the world when somebody's had a loss that we know of, that's obvious. Instead of staying away, you can just say, I don't know what to say. In your situation, people don't know there's a loss.
Yeah, a lot of times. Yeah. So you kind of, it's kind of one of those tricky scenarios where you're like educating people at the same time, which then becomes quite exhausting. So lots of times people just prefer to just, not engage, which I understand is it's a self-protection mechanism that will work for a certain period of time. But when you're constantly not engaging, or you're holding back from going out and about and meeting people, that starts to have a more detrimental effect. So at some point, I think it really is crucial that we feel these feelings and talk about them, be with them, and come up with some strategies of how are you going to interact in the world given your experience. It's not that you like leave behind, but it's something that you bring with you. So now that this has happened, how are we going to be out and about in the world?
For me, I have certain situations where I feel like it's in school when we had to have a buddy. But there's somebody where if I froze, or they would know. I could give a look or give a code word. So I could go to the bathroom, or they would take over. And that's comforting. There are certain things that I can do with anyone. And there are certain things I can only do with like my protective people.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a great strategy. And that shows that you have a really great friendship with that person or those people, that you can be like, hey, this might happen. I need you to do this if I give you this look or this hand signal or whatever, Yeah, that's great.
How can people work with you, and what do you have coming up?
So I do group programs online and one-on-one programs. The best way to find out about everything I have on offer is on my website, embodiedpossibility.com. I have a lot of free resources there. And I suggest starting with the Self-Compassion for Childless Women free self-guided course. There'll be a link to that in the show notes, I believe. But you can also find that on my website.
Anything I am forgetting to ask?
I'm quite active on Instagram at Embodied Possibility. So that's another way to see what I'm up to. I write a weekly article that I publish on my website, but then over on Instagram as well, a lot about integrating childless grief, finding meaning as a childless woman, answering intrusive questions, how to navigate social media. So all like topics that are very relevant to a childless woman's journey.
I would add, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, how can things be more inclusive? My friends, I told, I'd still love to come. You can invite
Mhm.
me to the parties, even though I don't have a spouse or a child. So to
Mhm.
anyone listening, sometimes some people still want to be there. And I
Mhm.
feel like things are very separated. I don't know if you ever addressed that, but
Mhm. Yeah, it all comes down to communicating. You know, there was a period of time where my friends were having children and I wasn't able to. Pregnancy losses, infertility, and I was getting invites to the baby showers, but I did not want to go. And so and I only realized that after suffering through quite a few and being like, oh, this is awful. Like, I never want to do this to myself again. But in the beginning, I was like, well, I should be supportive to them and I don't want to make this about me. And I want to have the capacity to feel joy and happiness for this person, despite my scenario being different. But it took a long time to get there. It took a long time of, being with my own grief and figuring out my own feelings. Uh, but having conversations, and there came a point where I was just saying no to every baby shower, and that was fine. But now it's a number of years later, and the children are older and they're having birthday parties. And I've thought, like, oh, I'd actually like to be invited. Like, that looks like fun, seeing the pictures looks fun. And I'm in a place where I could go and I would enjoy it. So the same person who I said, no, sorry, I can't come to your baby shower. Now, 4 years later, I said, I saw pictures of the birthday party, and next year I'd really love to come. Would you mind inviting me? So I think it's that same thing about having the confidence that you build through working on your own stuff, being able to be with your own grief and your own feelings, and having good enough relationships with your people to be able to navigate it. And maybe the birthday will come around and I'll be like, actually, I know that I said that I wanted to be invited, but now that it's the day before going, I don't think I'll be able to come, And the person that I'm thinking of in this scenario would be like, yeah, I totally get it. I'll ask you again next time. I think we have this fear that if we show up as ourselves with our whole scope of emotions, people are just going to be like, whoa, that person's too much. Like, get out of here. They say they want to come and now they're not coming and they're making it about them. But that true friendships and good relationships with good communication and good boundaries, that's not how it goes.
Great point. There were people who only knew me the way I had been my entire life. So they invited me to the things that they had always invited me to. But those things seemed impossible. So I was saying no. They didn't know any better. I had to let them know I have to do new things. They wouldn't have thought to pick new things. I had to say, I don't want to leave my dog. She's grieving too. I'll do anything dog inclusive. They weren't being rude or neglectful. They were doing the things that we had always done.
Totally.
So, and being able to say those things seems like, oh my God, will they be upset? The minute I told them, it was simple. It was a very simple change. They were just doing what we had always done.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it might not go that way. It might be a bit messy. Somebody might get upset, but then they'll cool down and then there's an opportunity to have an adult conversation like, hey, when that thing happened a couple weeks ago, let's talk about it.
Well, there are always secondary losses along the way, as
Huge.
so my people stuck around. Not everyone did.
Yes, absolutely, which is really hard to realize at the time. And it's also a blessing later on because you're not trying to work with a friendship that doesn't actually have a basis for outlasting the hard things in life. And as we get older, there's going to be more and more and more hard things. So these are the folks you want to have, the folks that can weather the storm. You want to know who they are and encourage them to stick around. And those that are there just for the short time, wish them well and revert your focus either to yourself or to folks who can be with you where you're at.
And I don't know about you, but pretty much everyone else I connect with says it's hurtful. But as soon as we let them go, it opens up the door for these new people to come in who are gifts. It's not great to connect because of grief, but we have these new people.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a foundation of understanding there where you don't have to do the educating, that you don't have to worry about, offending somebody with your needs or somebody being uncomfortable with sort of like the messiness of it, because they get it. There's a lot more grace.
Okay. Embodied possibility. Connect with Sarah Jane. Final thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's shows like this and people like you who are willing to have these conversations that really open up the doors for so many people to find their people.
Thank you so much for doing what you do and talking about one of the very, very least talked about forms of grief. And to everyone watching and listening, until next time, always be ruthless.